Thank you. Now we'll proceed with our presentations and discussions. So I would like to invite Mr. Joseph King to the front. So I would like to introduce Joseph King, our first presenter. Mr. King is a senior director at ICCROM, brings more than 30 years of experience in the field of World Heritage conservation and management. During his term at ICCROM, he served as the unit director of the site unit and was involved in the development and also implementation of the Africa 2009 program and the integrated territorial and urban conservation program as well. Today he will deliver a thematic presentation, particularly on cultural side, titled Exploring Approaches for the Application of Interpretation and Presentation in the World Heritage System. Thank you, Mr. King.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes? Good. Okay, thank you. First, let me take the opportunity to thank the Republic of Korea and actually Cha for what is actually now a really strong support and partnership, I'd say, with ICCROM over these last years. We've been very happy with our partnership with the Republic of Korea, and actually now WIPIC is the newest entry in that, but we're actually very happy to be collaborating with WIPIC, and going forward we look forward to even stronger collaborations both with Cha and with WIPIC. So on this topic of interpretation and presentation, we certainly consider it to be a very important one. And just as background, while there has never actually been a specific policy on interpretation or presentation in the World Heritage Convention, it is clear nevertheless that it is important for states parties as they plan to and inscribe properties on the World Heritage List that they really must be developing strategies to create a better understanding of that outstanding universal value for the general public, for tourists, and just in general. So I think that's the first thing that we need to keep in mind. Now, in the World Heritage Convention, in Article 4, it does mention the word presentation, and it mentions it as part of an integrated, let's say, definition of what we mean by safeguarding the cultural heritage. So we talk about identification, protection, conservation, presentation, and transmission to future generations. So it is there in the convention itself. But unfortunately, I think we have to say that the World Heritage Committee and the operational guidelines have never really defined what we mean by interpretation and presentation, and there hasn't really been a policy created. That's even better. Thank you. So maybe I'll put this down. Yes, is that better? Good. Thank you. Sorry. So there never really has been a good definition in the operational guidelines. There really never has been a policy that has been developed for this, and for that reason, actually, ICCROM considers it to be a very welcome development that WIPIC has been created. I know UNESCO approved it in 2019, and it has come to fruition now in, I guess, 2022 is the actual date. But we really consider this to be a very positive step forward in dealing with this issue. Now, I'm happy to say that WIPIC has already begun to work on establishing definitions for interpretation and presentation, and I suspect you're going to be hearing more about that today, right? So I won't talk about that more, but just to say that some of those definitions are being developed. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that in developing these kinds of policies, the first step that we have to look at is ICCMOS, because ICCMOS does have a charter on interpretation and presentation of cultural heritage sites. It was adopted by the ICCMOS General Assembly in 2008 in Quebec, and has been going forward. And there's actually a international tourism committee, I think, that actually works on this issue. So I think ICCMOS has already contributed significantly to this, and it's something that we need to keep in mind as we move forward. But having said that, it's certainly not a bad idea, in my opinion, at least, for the World Heritage Committee to start to start thinking about a policy, a particular policy for World Heritage in relationship to interpretation and presentation. Obviously, we should be using the ICOMOS Charter as a base, but I think there are certain things that we can consider, and what I'm offering you here today are just some reflections of mine in terms of what some of the key sort of principles we might be thinking about as we move forward on that. So that's where I'm starting. So this first slide that you're looking at I have 7 principles, and the slide that you're looking at now is the first one, which is a recognition that interpretation and presentation of World Heritage properties actually begin with the preparation of the nomination dossier itself. This is not something that you start doing once you're on the World Heritage list and suddenly it's like, oh my God, how am I going to interpret this? How am I going to present this? No, when you actually present the dossier itself, already there's been interpretation that's gone into that. The collection of information for the dossier, the identification of attributes, the creation of a convincing argument or a narrative for the OUV itself is the first step in the interpretation process. So I think this is something that we need to keep in mind, and I think that that's actually a very important. In fact, I often say to states parties as they're preparing nominations that they should really think about the nomination file as a narrative or a story. What is the story that you need to tell to make the argument that this has outstanding universal value? And that really is the first interpretation that needs to be done. My second principle is that the outstanding universal value of the property and its attributes are only one of the layers of significance of the property. Now, interestingly enough, I mean, I had prepared this presentation before coming here, but we had an interesting discussion with some people from the Indigenous Peoples Forum earlier, and they were actually making the same argument, that there are a lot of values, indigenous values that are part of World Heritage Sites, but are not necessarily part of the outstanding universal value of the property, but in fact they are important parts of the property. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind that when we tell the story, we have to tell the whole story, and we have to make sure that we incorporate all of the significance of a property when we're telling its story, let's say. We absolutely have to tell the OUV, there's no doubt about that, but we also have to go beyond that. The example that I want to use of that is, sorry, actually, can I go back? Yes, is this building that you see right here, which is Fort Jesus Museum in Mombasa, Kenya, which is actually the place where I started working in cultural heritage 35 years ago. And this is on the World Heritage list. This building, it is inscribed on the list as a Portuguese fort. It was a Portuguese fort built in the 15th century, and its OUV is linked primarily to its architectural values, and also the fact that it was a place where there was a mix of cultures, Swahili culture, European culture, and other cultures. But so that's what the OUV of it is. But in fact, actually, I'm happy to say that when I went back to Kenya fairly recently and paid a visit to Fort Jesus, they've started to expand on that story. They've started to expand on the interpretation and the presentation. Now, the picture, the bottom picture on my left, I guess it's also your left, is within the fort. It's a small building within the fort, and it's actually called the Omani House. Now, this has actually always been there, back even in the 1980s when I was working there, because Oman has always had an important role also on the coast of East Africa. There's always been a lot of interaction back and forth. So the Omani House has always been there, and there's been interpretation at Fort Jesus to explain the Omani relationship to the East African coast, etc. But I was happy when I went back, actually just this past March, to see that they've started adding other additional exhibits now. So the two pictures on the right are a small part of the exhibition dealing with the Baluchi ethnic group that is there. This is a group that originates in India, and there was a migration to the East African coast. I think at the beginning of the late 19th century, I think early 20th century. But they're an important community within Mombasa. And so what's happened now is that there's a space within Fort Jesus which actually also tells the story of this community that is an important part of Mombasa, where Fort Jesus is. So that actually made me very happy that they were starting to expand the story. I was even happier when I saw another exhibition which was highlighting the African archaeologists that have been involved in archaeology on the East African coast for many years. And I was happy about this because this is a part of the story that's actually often forgotten. When we think about the archaeologists, I mean, the person who wrote the big, thick story of For Jesus was an Englishman named Kirkman, and he's always the one that's associated when you go back and you read when you read the stories of this. That's what you hear about. But in fact, he was helped by a lot of African archaeologists and assistants and things like that. And so what happened was that there was an exhibition put up before I got there, which was actually highlighting the role of African archaeologists, not just 200 years ago, but even up until now, and the importance of African archaeologists. So again, here's an example of taking a story which was sort of fixed on a more colonial aspect, let's say, or only one part of the story, and now they've expanded it. They brought in the Baluchi community from Mombasa, and they brought in all the African archaeologists who have been involved with archaeology at Fort Jesus and on the East African coast. So I think this is something that I think is an important principle that we all need to be thinking about when we look at our World Heritage sites. Okay, so my third principle is the need to understand that there are multiple audiences for interpretation and preservation. When we think about interpretation and presentation, usually we focus about tourists. What is it that we want the visitors who are coming and paying the money to enhance our budgets, and so you wind up telling the story that you think the tourists are going to be interested in, but that's only part of the story. There are also young people in Mombasa. The second picture is young people in Mombasa actually who also need to know their story, and they also need to be able to understand things and interpret it and talk to other people about it. So the third principle is that we have to think about different levels of audiences to be part of this interpretation and preservation strategy. That leads then to the fourth principle, which is that this work is never finished. It would be really nice to be able to say, I'm going to tell the story, and that's going to be the story, and that's going to be the end of it. But you're always needing to do more research. You're always needing to have a better understanding. Some of the examples that I already showed you, talking about the other communities, talking about the African archaeologists, is in fact an additional work. It's an additional level of interpretation that comes in later, and that we need to be ready to and willing to update our story, let's say, and tell new stories and augment our stories. So I think that's the fourth principle. The fifth principle is this is something we're talking about a lot in a lot of side events now. The idea that presentation strategies need to be developed on site because you need to be able to look at things on site, but you also need to be looking at things at a distance now. I mean, certainly with AI and with 3D documentation and internet and all of those sorts of things, there are many different ways to present World Heritage sites. And so we need to be looking at this as what can we do on the site, and we also need to be looking at this as what kinds of interpretation can go out to a wider audience, on the internet using artificial intelligence, etc. I do want to put a caution here on this, though, that we shouldn't get to the point where we only focus on artificial intelligence or only focus on 3D, 3D presentation that can be digested off-site. We want people coming and looking at the authentic cultural heritage, and we need to make sure that we keep that in mind at all times. It's not the same thing. I live in Italy. It's not the same thing to look at Pompeii. This is actually Pompeii in the picture. It's not the same thing of looking at Pompeii on YouTube as it is actually going to the site and looking at Pompeii. So we really do need to be careful about that. Sixth point is that we also need to make sure that the interpretation and presentation is done in a way that does not interfere with or damage attributes of the property. The picture you see here is a tourist information sign that's stuck up on a wall, and is potentially damaging that wall in one way or another. So we also need to keep in mind that whatever interpretation and presentation we put up should be respectful of the place and should not have an interference with the attributes. And my final point, and anybody who knows ECROM is going to know that this is my final point before I even click the slide. Training and capacity building. I know you all expected it. So my seventh principle for this policy is to ensure that there is the necessary training and that training needs to be at all levels. We need to be aiming at professionals, we need to be aiming at site managers, but we also need to be working with communities. We need to be working with also even disadvantaged communities. We need to be looking at communities not as a monolith, but we actually need to be looking at different communities when we do this. So I think I've probably talked too long now, so I'll stop. And just to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing these issues with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your principles, including the important points that interpretation starts even before the inscription. Absolutely. And also we have important other values rather than the OUV and capacity building important. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And now we would like to invite Tim for your presentation. Tim is a director of the World Heritage Program at IUCN and has been leading IUCN Nature Culture Initiative for very long. So I know that you haven't got much time to prepare for this presentation, but it would be grateful for us if you could share your insight for us and for also the other heritage managers and audiences as well. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. Yes, full disclosure is, I guess, Joe had a week and I had an hour to get ready. But it is a pleasure to, I guess, play the nature-culture connection here and also represent IUCN's contributions to this discussion. Let me firstly say congratulations to WIPIC for coming together. And I think really my main message is this is an issue that's been greatly missed out of World Heritage for a very long time, but is actually very fundamental to what the World Heritage Convention is about. I'd also like to say thanks to the Cultural Heritage Administration, who we have a great and long-standing relationship with as IUCN as well, and we're also pleased to be developing new ideas about how that might also make some more connections to our work conserving natural sites in the World Heritage Convention. If I just make a few remarks and add to what Joe has said. So I actually started my career in the Centre for Environmental Interpretation in the United Kingdom. And so I guess approached this having understood from the beginning of my career that environmental interpretation is important. And it's important to understand that it's different to education and it's different to providing information. And I guess I grew up with the mantra of Freeman Tilden, the great American thinker that founded the idea of environmental interpretation, which is interpretation is about understanding and connection, and it's through the understanding and connection of a place that you get appreciation, and it's only if we have appreciation for a place that you really get a durable approach to conservation. And so in a way, it's about the love of the places that we're looking after, I think. Interpretation is not, it's not science, and it's not what we think people should know. It's actually about how we're trying to connect ourselves and the communities that care about World Heritage to places. I think you've asked me to talk a bit about the connection of nature and culture, but I actually think interpretation for me has always been about everything to do with the place. And in a way, it's a good test. What a site is doing in terms of interpretation is a good test about how inclusive it is of telling its stories, because really in nature conservation, in IUCN, we talk about geological diversity and geological heritage, and we talk about biodiversity and wildlife, and we do talk about people and their role in nature conservation. But if you think about the journey we've been on with connecting nature and culture, it's about everywhere, every place having a story that includes geological diversity and the deep time in the rocks underneath our feet, and the ecosystems that we live in, and the history and culture of the people that are living here now and have lived here before. And I think, although I'm not a cultural heritage person, I guess increasingly I feel a little bit I am. It's also about connecting the different ways people think about heritage. So the unhelpful separation of tangible and intangible heritage. Interpretation comes to life when it embraces how people respond to places, and so I don't really see a distinction. I think nature stories are culture stories. It's possible that whales and dolphins tell stories to each other, but really interpretation is the stories we're telling each other and have been telling each other about our places, and that's, you know, in that sense, nature is culture, and culture is part of our nature. And then maybe I'll just make 4 or 5 points to conclude. You know, it is a real surprise that this has been such an under-discussed issue when you think that Article 4 of the Convention says that one of the duties of a World Heritage Site is its presentation. So, you know, I think it is a real gap in practice, and it's very fundamental to conservation strategies. It also, I think, connects to another of the huge gaps, in my humble opinion, in the World Heritage Convention, which is, although interpretation is not only about tourism, it is one of the very tangible ways that sites connect to visitors, and yet in the World Heritage System we're also very, very underinvested in advice and standards and expectations for the experience of visitors of all their kinds to places. So I do think you're really addressing a very significant need. And then I think I'll just say 3 things about maybe some ideas about what's important. One of the things that I find very much missing in conservation practice is we tend to work in my mother tongue, Joe's mother tongue, or Mary-Law's mother tongue, and we very frequently leave out the fact that sites tell their stories in thousands of mother tongues, and that I've spent a lot of time with Eugene Cho, who runs the leadership program, talking about Korean ways of thinking about places, and it's a little bit different, and actually in some ways much more exciting to understand how Korean practitioners think about places, but that's different to, you know, any other place that is approaching how its significance is defined locally. So in our work in the Global Biodiversity Framework, the targets are about diverse worldviews, and I think interpretation might be one of the ways to really bring forward the diverse worldviews that exist across World Heritage areas. The second suggestion is to make connections not only in World Heritage but to the other UNESCO sites. UNESCO Global Geoparks reaccredit sites every 4 years, and they expect visibility and they expect connection to be part of the deal. What would the World Heritage Convention be like if every 4 years, if you weren't performing in showing off your World Heritage site to all your visitors, you had to leave the World Heritage list and only come back when you were doing a good job of showing off the site? That's how geoparks work. I can see Joe and Mary-Law are thinking, that could be a really good idea. And I think it might be an interesting idea, but why, I think we can learn from what other UNESCO sites, where there are much bigger expectations and therefore constituencies about presentation, are bringing their ideas forward. And lastly, I think the weird thing about this conundrum of the World Heritage Convention not paying much attention to interpretation is, if you go to World Heritage sites are doing heaps of interpretation, and they're doing brilliant interpretation. So I guess my last message is to really, penultimate message is to really reach out and learn from what sites are doing, and bring and share the best of practice. And I think the work we're doing at the Leadership Program and the Site Managers Forum is a very big opportunity. And the last thing, I don't know if Mary-Law's got the chance to speak, but I do think, actually, as I look at IUCN, it's strange to me that it's hard to find people in IUCN that work on interpretation, environmental interpretation. Even our Commission on Education and Communication has quite few people that think they're working on environmental interpretation. And I think actually amongst the 3 advisory bodies, really, ICOMOS, we saw the Charter has a corpus of experience which is extremely important for us to all sort of bring forward and learn from. So I guess my last suggestion is that it would be great to have more exchange between ICOMOS and IUCN and ICROM in this area. Thanks for that opportunity, and I'm afraid timekeeping is never good when you don't have time to prepare. As I say, if I had more time, I'd have written a shorter speech. But thanks very much for the opportunity to address you, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, team, for reminding us the unhelpful separation between nature and culture, intangible and intangible, so to get some comprehensive and holistic approaches and perspectives. It's not planned, but since Ikrom and IUCN spoke, and since Lazar invited, Marie-Laure, do you have anything to say for the ICOMOS perspective?
Well, nice to be with you. And my colleague Joe and friends have already said everything about ICOMOS, perhaps, and so I don't have so much to say. Well, just remind, as Joe said, that interpretation is a key area for ICOMOS with this charter that was elaborated in 2008. But we could see at ICOMOS General Assembly that took place last week in Sydney how bigger this area of work and research had been in almost 20 years. The change has been huge. That was one of the reflections that we made among ourselves after the General Assembly. So, and there is still a lot to do. Perhaps the other point that I could mention, because Joe said also that the interpretation started not only after the inscription of a site, but in the nomination dossier. That's a very good point and very interesting point. Recently, we invited to the ICOMOS evaluation panel a very respected and very old expert who has been expert in the panel almost 30 years ago, at the very beginning of the ICOMOS work as advisory body. And after the panel, I had a discussion with him and asked him, has it changed a lot? How is it now compared to 30 years ago? And he said, so different, because now everything is about the narrative. 30 years ago, we were just speaking of integrity, boundaries, and it went very fast. But the issue of the narrative was almost not touched. So this is really a very important part now of the evaluation of a nomination. And then perhaps a last point also on the fact that, yes, the narrative, it's the story, and as Tim said, there is not just one story for a place. It's like in your life, there is not just one story of your life. You could tell the story of your life in many different ways, and the story of a family is the same. Different members of the family could tell the story of the family in different manners. And sometimes the issue is that these stories are conflicting, and that's difficult. Well, in life, for human people, we have therapists, for instance, to help reconciliate the different stories. We don't have that in our field, so maybe it's our responsibility of all heritage, the people who care for heritage and who care for memories, to contribute to these efforts of reconciliating stories when it has to be done. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Laure, for the ICOMOS input. So the changes between 30 years has been a lot. So before it was all about the boundaries and everything, but now it's the narrative and inclusive heritage interpretation is very important. So now let's proceed with the WIPIC presentation. So I'll be presenting a presentation. So just for a second.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harry, the head of Education and Networking Office. I'll be presenting heritage interpretation and WIPIC's contribution. So I'll be briefly giving you overview of the WIPIC and also the main activities and contribution, and telling what is heritage interpretation and why do we need it. So as you know, WIPIC is the first UNESCO organization solely focusing on the heritage interpretation and presentation. So we were established just last year, located in Sejong City, which is basically an administrative capital of the Republic of Korea. So our mission is to develop an inclusive heritage interpretation and presentation, and so ultimately to contribute to the harmonious value of World Heritage Sites and sustainable development of the society. So we have these main three functions: research, capacity building, and information sharing. And this was very basic information of the WIPIC, and I would like to share the necessity of interpretation and presentation of World Heritage Site, sharing some of our research outcomes. So we wanted to analyze the context of the term used on term interpretation in the World Heritage Committee decisions for the last 3 years, from 2019 to 2021. So we analyzed the contextual usage of the interpretation in the decisions and examined the trend by year and topic. So the total number was the 41 cases. You could see that the figures doesn't explicitly show that it's increasing at the moment, but we'll have to see the data of the 2022 and 3 as well. So we found out that in the earlier years, interpretation term is mixed with very different concepts. For instance, in 2019, it says an integrated management needed with the following themes: conservation, community involvement, as well as interpretation, presentation, and visitor management. And in 2022, it says request for a best international practice for interpretation strategies on the interpretation of the full history of the property. So it means that in the second example, you could see that it has a connotation of very careful look into the holistic and full history, whereas the first one considers interpretation as one of other elements of the preservation management. So we need a discussion for a clear definition of the heritage interpretation is needed, and also we found out that the need for interpretation is arising in increasingly diverse and distinct context. So for instance, in 2021, it says request for a rehabilitation of the site museum that should be planned with a comprehensive approach of the interpretation of all values. And in 2021, one example is a gradually improve their interpretation and exhibition for educational and outreach purposes. So if you see the second one, it has more of an education and presentation aspect of a connotation, whereas the first one has a little bit different, like inclusive interpretation aspects. So maybe enhancing stakeholders' capacity to implement effective interpretation strategies across various stakeholders is crucial. So this is the figure that we found. So before, we have a lot of just simple statements, simple listing of interpretation among the decision has a lot, but it's decreasing at the moment. Whereas interpretation with the connotation of holistic and comprehensive is increasing at the moment. So we can see this trend in 2019 and 2020, whereas we see more of a comprehensive and holistic approach is increasing in 2021. So in response to these issues and demands in World Heritage, WIPIC plans and conducts research, capacity building, and information sharing programs. So we want to share a basic idea of our research questions. So our objective is supporting UNESCO and World Heritage Convention. And also we want to contribute to the effective implementation of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention as well. So our basic and fundamental research question is, what are heritage interpretation and presentation? And why heritage interpretation are important for World Heritage System? And also, what do we need for a better interpretation and presentation? So what is heritage interpretation? So like Joe mentioned, we formed an international working group to discuss the basic concepts and definitions of heritage interpretation last year. And these are the key points discussed within the international working group that we formed for the definitions and concepts of heritage interpretation. So the first one is World Heritage Convention and the operational guideline use both terms without any further explanation. Second, heritage communities are no longer to be educated, but to engage to heritage processes. And thirdly, heritage interpretation affects all stages of discovery, analysis, and communication of heritage values. And finally, each concept of heritage interpretation and presentation has their own unique roles and impacts in heritage processes. These are our findings. So throughout these working groups, the surveys and conference, and also literature reviews, we were able to reach a consensus of a sentence of definition that is, at the moment it's draft, heritage interpretation is a meaning-making process through communication, participation, and experience. It increases understanding and promotes connections between people and heritage places. So this is the definition sentence at the moment, but it's still revising. So if you have any opinion about this, please let us know in the Q&A session. And then why heritage interpretation is important for a World Heritage System. So we also have the International Working Group for the policy research on heritage interpretation. And the working group also found out that heritage interpretation does contribute to sustainable development, including encouraging inclusiveness, community engagement and well-being, nature-culture linking, and also world heritage resilience, regional issues of world heritage. And you might, if you came from the site, you might know the attributes are getting important for the heritage impact assessment as well. So attribute in a word is the smallest element consisting the OUV and other important values. So we also want to understand on attribute mapping and context and association on the property based on the credible information for the full range of heritage interpretation. And finally, we do have our small research team for dissonant heritage as well. So we strongly believe that encouraging dialogues between related communities and state parties, introducing inclusive interpretation strategy that can respect different perspectives related to sites of memory associated with recent conflicts. So based on these researches and findings, we also have a very strong capacity building programs for the worldwide. So our goal for the capacity building, particularly on heritage interpretation, is to strengthen heritage interpretation to resolve relevant issues responding to emerging priorities of World Heritage Sites. And also we want to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals in the expansion of the concept of World Heritage. And along with capacity building, we do have awareness raising, and we want to widen the audience and stakeholders participating to the heritage management processes. And also we want to have a bottom-up approaches for heritage interpretation and linking the government and academia and private sectors as well. So these are some infographic that we seek through capacity building and the awareness raising. And since this is our very year one, we do have some capacity building programs, particularly in Africa. So I would like to introduce. So from last year, we did have our foundational research on the capacity building programs. So we did a survey on every existing World Heritage capacity building programs, and we analyzed the gap area so that we could contribute. So we were able to draw modules for the core courses and advanced courses. For this study, we included Eugene and Sarah for our members. So based on this curriculum, we are currently engaging in the Great Zimbabwe Rehabilitation Program, which is a UNESCO-commissioned 2-year program funded by the French government. So we are currently in the program development of an inclusive and holistic interpretation and storytelling for the Great Zimbabwe World Heritage Site. And currently, WIPIC is leading the heritage interpretation component in the rehabilitation program. So currently we're working with the UNESCO Harare and also the local team, including the Great Zimbabwe University and the National Monument and Museums of Zimbabwe as well. So for this program, we particularly, for the last few months, we particularly were making this tool for the implementing inclusive World Heritage interpretation and presentation. So we'll be probably publishing it as a booklet So this is very like a gist and summary of the 11 steps consisting of this tool, starting from the creating the heritage interpretation core team to the very end 11th step of the post-narrative analysis process for the sustainable interpretation and presentation. So we will be having a consultation with other experts, and we'll be publishing soon. And we are also having another African World Heritage interpretation workshop. Currently working with the African World Heritage Fund, a 5-year MOU. So we will be having the World Heritage Capacity Building Program for heritage managers in Africa. We'll be having a 3-day workshop in 12-Fontein this year in Namibia from early November. So the call just went out yesterday. So if you can distribute into your network, it would be really grateful. And of course, we do have some national programs for the Korean heritage managers and site managers. We provide capacity building opportunities for the World Heritage Site managers in Korea. And we also want to contribute to the local. So we do have ICE outside of school for the local students. And currently, the Arab Center, actually, for the World Heritage, invited us to contribute to the capacity building workshop of their division. So we'll be also contributing to the assistance for the sustainable management of World Heritage properties for the Tunisia in October. The site called Duga. So our goal is to actually involve communities, local institute, and stakeholders in the management of Duga, and also integrate heritage into the social and economic development as well. So finally, we do have efforts for dissemination of WIPIC's achievements. So ultimately, in 2025, we want to have an information platform where everyone can easily access to the information and data of heritage information, interpretation. So at the moment, we're collecting data, and we try to secure a lot of funding from the government for the promotion of inclusive heritage interpretation and presentation. And finally, we do have the publications as well. So we have yearly periodicals called Interpreting World Heritage, and this year's edition has just out, so you can access to our website and download easily to see the periodicals. And on the right side, you can also see that we are collaborating with the other YouTubers and also other artists and heritage managers to make small videos to collaborate with the individuals from the communities. So finally, what are we aiming to in the future? So throughout this research, capacity building, networking, and information sharing, we want to provide a new knowledge framework on heritage interpretation, and we want people actively use this produced knowledge. And also, we want to generate the multiple voices and discussions in heritage interpretation. So finally, we want World Heritage System that contribute to the peace building and UNESCO agendas through heritage interpretation and presentation by active community engagement and discussions of the state parties. So this concludes my presentation of heritage interpretation and WIPIC.